Dr. Vaishali today for the program, and we haven't heard from, but these are both PhD students in the lab, and I will most likely ask them to talk about answer some of the questions as well, because they have quite a lot of expertise in butterfly biology along with me. So again, thanks for inviting me. And Namrata, can you start off with some questions that you have already uh, curated and prepared?
Okay, so we have an interesting question from Shornali Roy. So, how do caterpillars know when it is time to turn into a chrysalis?
Okay. So there are several reasons. First is that, of course, the development has to complete if the caterpillar hasn't grown enough. And if you have heard this, caterpillars also go through multiple instars or stages. Between each molting, there's a period which is called an instar. So they have to go through several instars before they can pupate. If they don't have enough food to finish that metamorphosis, then of course they won't be able to uh, go from the caterpillar stage to pupal stage. But if it is fed, then of course there may be several environmental cues. For example, some caterpillars start uh, to go in dormancy when the temperature falls too low, and typically this is in temperate areas or in Himalayan regions where temperature goes really, really low beyond a very short growing season, and after that caterpillars would stay dormant, or they might pupate and the pupae will remain dormant. So they use certain environmental cues to decide when they want to go into what we call diapause, and then they will stay dormant. But if they're going to pupate, then they will use similar environmental cues, similar climatic changes to decide when they will pupate, if they're going to remain dormant. If they're not going to remain dormant, if it's a regular pupation sequence, then again, I'll pass this on to my students if they know some more information on this. But my understanding is that when they're fed enough, when they've grown enough, then it's time to pupate. So when they've grown enough in the last instar that they could finish all they have finished all the growth that they could finish, in which case the next molt is going to turn them into a pupa. So that is the sort of the physiological cue that it's time to molt, and that last molting is going to turn it into a pupa. Do you have anything else to add? No. Okay. So that's all the information we have on what are the sorts of cues that they use to decide when they're going to pupate. Another thing, actually, there's one more reason I just remembered, which is that if caterpillars have had enough food to eat so that they could grow up to a stage when pupation is feasible, pupation is viable, then if suddenly food runs out, at that time they see that the host plant is running out, and that they might realize by just seeing that, feeling that there are not too many green tissue left on the host plant or too many leaves or whatever else that they're eating. So if they start to run out of food at a stage when their growth is at a stage when they have enough to put off as nutrients saved for the pupation stage, then they can still pupate, even if they haven't grown to the right size that they would normally grow to before pupation. So sometimes you will encounter these really tiny butterflies. They might be half the size of regular butterflies. Typically, those are a result of caterpillars starving in the last instar that they would pupate early. So these are some of the cues that caterpillars use to decide when to pupate. Yeah.
All
Do you have
right.
any extension to that question? If you have, you can ask that. Otherwise, Namrata can go to the next question.
So, then there's a question like which life cycle of butterflies faces the greatest risk of predation? By Ovik Banerjee.
It's an interesting question, but a very hard question. Butterflies being so tiny and the world being full of predators, it's hard to objectively judge which stage is more vulnerable to predators. Right from the egg stage, there may be 1,000 different kinds of insects and other invertebrates which can eat them. And there are also parasitoids. Parasitoids are these small insects, typically flies and wasps, which will lay eggs inside the butterfly, and their larvae will eat the butterfly egg. And then you might have these young flies and wasps emerge out of the butterfly egg rather than a caterpillar. So right from that stage, butterflies are vulnerable, and that vulnerability to parasitoids and predators never really goes away. In species like plain tiger and Jezebel, 70, 80, 90% of the caterpillars might get parasitized, and that many caterpillars then don't make it into a pupal stage. Or if they make it into a pupal stage, out of the pupa comes a wasp or a fly, not a butterfly, right? So predation can be that harsh, and this is just from one particular female which might lay eggs inside a caterpillar or an egg, right? So you can imagine that predation pressure is really intense. You never have a situation where predation pressure is relaxed. You have a vast number of predators which can eat eggs, caterpillars, and then pupae. And then, of course, butterflies when the adult butterflies come out. But if I have to choose one particular stage where predation is a little bit less, it's probably pupa. Pupae are really, really hard to find. And they're really hard to find for us, butterfly watchers. So I suspect that even for predators, it's a slightly more, it's a harder stage to locate. And therefore, predation may be less in the pupal stage. But all the other three stages, eggs, caterpillars, and adult butterflies, I think there's really intense pressure. Among those three stages, I don't think anybody can address which stage is more vulnerable to predators or predation. Yeah. Anything more to add?
Why the pupae are hard?
Ah, you explain.
So the pupae are generally harder to find because they camouflage very well in their background. And depending on the substrate and some other cues like um, color of the substrate or texture of the substrate, they can have multiple morphs or forms of the pupa. So, for example, in some Papilio species, the pupa can be green if it pupates on a leaf or a fresh twig, and it can be brown if it pupates on the bark or on a rough surface. So, because of that, they blend into their background very well and makes it very hard to spot. And some pupae resemble the twigs of the plant that they feed on so well that you sometimes cannot tell whether it's a pupa or a stem. So they're very good at camouflaging.
Good. Next question.
So, what is the red liquid which comes out of the abdomen of a butterfly after emergence?
We'll take this. So that is called meconium. It's basically waste products that the pupa keeps on accumulating during that stage. So caterpillars can poop, butterflies can poop, but pupae cannot poop. Yeah. So whatever metabolism that happens in the pupal stage, all of that just accumulates inside the abdomen of the pupa. So as the pupa develops from day 1 to nth day when the butterfly is going to come out, all of those metabolic waste products keep on accumulating towards the end of the abdomen. And that mass, of course, keeps on growing as the pupa metabolizes all the nutrients it has and all the other processes that happen. So when the butterfly comes out, those waste products, the poop of the pupa basically is what is discarded. And that is the reddish or yellowish or brownish fluid which butterflies put out when they're drying their wings. So typically it will take them a couple of minutes before they do this. So as they hang from a substratum to dry their wings and completely unfold them, at that time, they will adjust the wings in such a way that the poop doesn't get entangled in the wings. It just falls down, and that is what you see. So there's nothing pretty about that particular thing. It's the poop of the butterfly, or the pupa, really.
So shall I ask the next question?
Sure.
At which stage of life cycle of a butterfly is the sex, and like of early stage, is the sex determined, and what is the trigger behind it?
That I'm going to go to give to Riddhi because she's even expert on this.
So sex is usually determined at the embryonic stage, so within the eggs. However, the sex organs start developing much later. So I have observed testicles developing in males in the fourth instar, so in the second to last instar of the larva, and proper sex organs that you see in the adults develop during pupal stages. So even though sex is determined early in embryonic stages, you won't see the sexual structures till late into larval development or when they come out as adults.
But the sex itself is determined when the egg is made, right?
Yeah.
So females in butterflies have two chromosomes, Z and W chromosome, exactly opposite of what humans have. Where males have two kinds of gametes, one containing X chromosome and the other containing Y chromosome. In butterflies, females have two kinds of gametes, one containing Z chromosome and the second containing W chromosome. So the half of the answer of what determines sex is the kind of egg that a female makes. And males make the same kind of gamete, both containing Z chromosome, whether one of the Z chromosomes goes into a particular egg is more or less probabilistic. But when the egg is fertilized, that is the stage when the sex itself is determined based on the chromosomes. But after that, as Riddhi mentioned, this is the early embryonic stage, or rather the zygote stage, at which sex is determined to begin with. But then beyond the zygote is formed, there are various stages at which sex can still be altered. Not fully, not completely perhaps, but what is chromosomally a male or a female can still develop as the opposite sex, simply because something goes unusually during the development. So the bodies of the butterfly, as bodies of the humans, can be chromosomally one sex, but physiologically and anatomically another sex. That happens even in butterflies. So it's a slightly more complex process, but the simple answer is the chromosomal combination in the zygote first determines the sex, but then during development, all the things have to go as they're supposed to go normally, and that will then ultimately make male and female bodies. And that process itself starts really early during egg development. In fact, before the egg is laid, the sex is already determined. So an egg is already on a path to become male or female even before the egg is laid. Right after the fertilization is done, that egg is already on way to become a male or female butterfly. But as I mentioned, all these genes, the whole developmental network has to coordinate more or less very well, more or less perfectly, to make a functional male and female body. And that happens over a much longer period. But there are two very distinct activity peaks. First is in the embryonic stage, right after the zygote stage, when cells start to divide, and then male and female bodies are set on the path. That's the first major peak when male and female sex is determined. The second major stage is in the fifth instar, when male and female specific wing patterns start already to get set on their way. And then, of course, when the pupa is developing, at that time, as Riddhi mentioned, male and female genitalia start to develop. And that is what ultimately determines when the butterfly comes out, whether it's going to look like a male butterfly or a female butterfly. Yeah, so there are these two peaks, one in early developmental stages, embryonic stages, and the next one during pupal stages, but really beginning from the last instar. So the final stage of the caterpillar. Next question.
So we have a question from Shantanu. How do butterflies sleep or roost? And is their general awareness decreased during the sleep phase?
So I think somebody in Eco Park was studying sleep behavior in butterflies, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah,
Who
our
was it?
intern. We had an intern, Prayash.
Oh, none of the existing members was doing that. Otherwise, I would have asked you to answer it.
So we have seen that, yeah, they do show reduced activity. Like if you handle them, they do not, like if you put it back, they go to sleep right away. We have seen that happening in general. So I would assume that it means decreased activity. And generally they hang up, like they use their feet to hang from twigs or branches and in shaded areas to roost generally.
So there are two ways that butterflies roost, two major ways. Species like Graciolos, for example, go on the underside of the
Yeah.
leaf. A lot of parrots actually do. They will go and sit on the underside of the leaf and then hang from the leaf uh, to sleep. And then others will just sit on the upper side of a bark or a leaf and then sleep there. But the general pattern is before their activity period ceases, depending on species. But if we are talking about a normal day flying butterfly, then when it starts to get late in the afternoon, they would just find a good spot where they want to sleep for the night, settle down there, and if they are not disturbed, they will just continue to settle there, sit there. So insects, unlike many mammals, certainly humans, don't have deep sleep like we do. They do have a dormancy period. Their metabolism certainly goes down, and they're not as active. They're not actively getting all the information from the environment, both because it's dark and or cold or any other cues that they might use to decide when to go to sleep. But depending on those cues, they're not really taking in all the information. So in some sense, their brain had shut down a little bit like what we do in the sleep. But of course, like in us, the brain is not completely shut down. There may be memory consolidation. There may be whole sorts of other things which make sleep really essential. So all the higher organisms, and by higher, I mean more complex organisms with a very well developed nervous system and a fairly complex body and a daily life. Those things definitely show daily and nightly activity patterns. And you see this even going into very, very simple organisms like bacteria. But it's much more obvious externally. Bacterial cell also you can see daily and nightly cycles if you look at within cell activity. But for things like insects, which are fairly complex organisms, you will see very prominent daily and nightly activity in the brains of insects. But the way you can tell whether an insect is sleeping or not is not really easy compared to, let's say, mammals. If you take a picture of a sleeping mammal or sleeping bird, I think more or less you will be fairly certain that it's sleeping. With insects, it's hard. If I take a picture of a butterfly, let's say in the understory during the day, with a pretty good flash, you won't be able to say just from the way the butterfly is sitting, whether it's day or night and whether it's sleeping or not. So there's no external manifestation of sleep in case of butterflies. So there are various ways in which butterfly sleep differs from ours. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to judge whether a butterfly is asleep or not. But typically, when butterflies are asleep, they won't respond very well if you go really close. If they're active and you try to go close to them, they're going to take off. When they're asleep, they will tolerate you coming close. Until you touch them, they won't try to fly. So certainly they're not taking in cues, certainly they're not processing them and processing the danger that is approaching. So in that sense, you can tell from their behavior whether they're asleep or not, but not externally, not just from the way they're sitting. So there's some really important ways in which it differs. Have I completely addressed your question? Because your question was a little bit open-ended, so I could.
No, I kind of, yes, you have addressed the question, but there is a follow-up question, if I may.
Okay, sure.
My thing is that do insects, butterflies specifically, and insects in general, do they follow any rhythm of sleep? Like we have a circadian rhythm. So by artificially, if we deprive light, sound, etc. from the environment, would the butterfly go off to sleep?
They will have a circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythm is found in all organisms, absolutely all. There is not a single organism I know which does not show circadian rhythm. And the genes which are used for circadian rhythm, those also you will see in pretty much all the organisms, except perhaps a few. But even inside, even parasites which will live inside the bodies of their hosts, even they show circadian rhythm. So they may not directly get cues from the external environment outside the host, but for parasites which live inside the bodies of other organisms, their external environment is the host body. Even those organisms do show circadian rhythms. And they're pretty well-known genes. Again, Riddhi can tell you more. Actually, even Vaishali can tell you more about genes for circadian rhythm. But they are very much active in butterflies. And in daily lives of butterflies, they are playing a pretty important role. So if you put butterflies in an artificial environment where the external cycles of light and dark and temperature and whatever else they use as cues to find out whether it's day or night and whether they should be active, those things can be manipulated by putting them in a controlled environment where you are where you're specifically manipulating those things out of sync with what you see in nature. So you could expose butterflies to these kinds of unnatural experiments, and they will respond to that. So yes, these can be manipulated, and they have been manipulated. Even in butterflies, monarchs, for example, have been put into this kind of artificial chambers where temperature, humidity, other climatic factors, as well as the day and night light cycles have been manipulated. People do this actually regularly for all kinds of insects. In Drosophila, the fruit flies, people who study Drosophila behavior, Drosophila physiology, genetics, they expose Drosophila to this kind of manipulations all the time. So this is not only in butterflies, in all insects you will see diurnal and nocturnal activities determined by the climatic fluctuations and light-dark cycles, which can be manipulated. Does that address it completely?
Thank you so much.
All right, great.
So Abhishek Paliwal had an observation. He saw two gram blue butterflies mating, and after a couple of minutes, another gram blue came there and started to interrupt the meeting by trying to attach its abdomen with the mating pair's abdomen. So, what is that behavior?
You tell me.
It just wants, like, the females are generally less than males, so it's probably just trying to mate.
Receptive females are much less than males. So most of the female butterflies that you will encounter in the field are mated.
Already mated.
Get mated very early after they close from the pupae. So if they're mated and they don't need any more nutrients to make more eggs, then they are reluctant to mate. So males may try to court, but females may be reluctant to mate, in which case males can't really chase them for too long. Females are busy laying eggs. But when mating is happening, the female is not flying away easily. So the pair is there. So most of these cases where a third or a second male, a third butterfly is trying to mate, really don't go anywhere. When mating starts, the male and female are already positioned in the proper way so that the female genitalia are already occupied by the male genitalia, in which case a third male, a second male can't really do anything. But they still try to attach. In fact, there are quite a few images out there, you will see where a second male has already positioned itself. In some way, its genitalia close to the female genitalia, but that's not really leading to any sperm passing from that second male to the female. So these matings don't lead anywhere, but these males don't encounter too many receptive females, and these are mostly just extremely strongly led by instinct. So they see a female, they can smell a female, they want to mate with her. She's not flying away, so they can try to mate with her. So they'll just pair up, but at some point that male is going to give up and then fly away. That is what's happening.
So he had a follow-up question like, why do butterflies remain attached for so long during mating? Like even during roosting, they remain attached.
Well, every species is going to have certain period, certain amount of time when they need to mate, right? In case of mammals, most mammals at least, mating can be really quick because only sperm are passed on and some other proteins which go along with that. In case of a lot of invertebrates, it's not just the sperm which is passed on, but also a lot of nutrients. So a lot of higher organisms, not higher organisms, a lot of vertebrates, especially birds and mammals, they have a very, very quick mating. In most cases, it will last for not more than a few seconds. Even in really large organisms like, let's say, tigers or elephants, the mating doesn't last for very long. In case of tigers, lions, all these big cats, it lasts only for, not more than 10-15 seconds max. So there it's easy simply because only sperm are going to be passed on. In case of invertebrates, most invertebrates that have been studied, it's the sperm along with the nutrients that need to be passed on, and they're passed on as a package. So to pass on all of that from male to female takes a little bit of time. So typically matings in insects last for 15 minutes, half an hour, 1 hour to several hours. But because so many nutrients need to be passed on, males don't have a new package ready in most species. They have to squeeze all those nutrients and then sperm into a single cohesive package as they pass it on to the female. And that package also is semi-solid. It's not completely, it's not just seminal fluid that they're going to pass on. And because this is something that they'll have to squeeze, mix sperm, nutrients are kept somewhere else, sperm are kept somewhere else, they have to be mixed into one single package and then passed on to the female. And also the male has to stay on there for some time while this package is getting solidified a little bit. Otherwise, there's a danger that as soon as they separate, another male will come and start mating with the female, and that is going to mess up with the nuptial gift given by the first female. So even after the package is, the spermatophore is passed on, they stay on in that mating phase for a little bit longer, so that when the male separates from the female cannot really mate immediately after that. And therefore, that male's contribution to the female sperm and nutrients are a little bit more secure inside the female before they will separate. That's another reason why it takes a little bit longer for butterflies to finish mating. I see there are quite a few people now, and I see there's Dr. Bhoj Acharya. He's from Sikkim. So if there are any questions from the more academic crowd, you can potentially put it in the chat box. And there's actually a question about butterfly garden. I'll actually leave that alone. We'll talk more about biology. There were a few sessions done on butterfly gardening and creating habitats. So this question would have been really nice in that session, and probably there are a few more sessions where this question could be asked. Another question in the chat box is, why should we need to conserve butterflies? Other than pollination, in what ways does butterfly help us? Why butterflies have so bright and colorful wings? So first question I'll skip in this particular session. Butterflies are not there for us to be helped. Yeah. So part of your question is, apart from pollination, in what ways do butterflies help us? Butterflies don't give a damn about you and what humans have to do. Why do you have to conserve us? There is no easy answer to that. If some butterfly species go away, will the ecosystems collapse? Probably not. But I think it's very sad that you have to ask that question. Why should we care about butterflies and why should we conserve them? I mean, butterflies are out there, they give you pleasure. Is that not good enough reason to conserve them? And if you're going to ask me what is really they're doing for us, even if I tell you, you will get 1 crore rupees by services that butterflies provide, you can get 100 crores by mining something. So I really don't want to even begin to address that question. Yeah, you should conserve butterflies because you care, and that should be a good enough answer. But I won't go into the details of that. So in some sense, I'm really not going to answer that. Why butterflies have so bright and colorful wings? That's a very good question. Why do you think they do? Any guesses in the audience? This question is asked by Drishya Krishnan, by the way. Drishya, can you tell me how old are you?
Yeah, she's not there in the participant list anymore. I think she got logged out or something.
Okay, all right. I assume that she is going to be a young person.
She messaged 20.
So you should be able
Yeah,
to
just message
address
she's 20.
why.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, impress other butterflies. If you're a male, you want to impress females. One easy answer, why they're so bright and colorful. The other answer to it is that butterflies, some of the butterflies are toxic. They're chemically protected, and therefore they want to advertise that chemically protected nature as well. And a lot of butterflies which are bright and colorful will fall in that category. Plain tiger, crimson rose, red Pierrot, potentially. There are several species which are known to contain some toxic compounds. And those butterflies then advertise that toxicity just so predators won't even try to eat them. That's another reason. So those are the two main reasons why they are so bright, attracting mates and then telling predators that they shouldn't eat them. All right, one question from you, Namrata, something that you have cleaned up, then we'll come back to the chat box.
Yeah, 1 minute. So Shantanu wanted to ask, like, why do female butterflies puddle sometimes?
Why do they puddle? So puddling is mainly done to get nutrients, rare nutrients that caterpillars don't get from the larvalose plants. So plants are really packed with carbon. Adult butterflies don't need carbon. They have got enough. They have put away enough as caterpillars when they were eating, but they don't get too many amino acids. They don't get too many sugars. They don't get too many proteins by eating those leaves. Typically, most caterpillars eat leaves. There are some predatory caterpillars which will eat other insects, but very few of them. And those who do eat other insects probably get a lot more proteins than regular plant feeding caterpillars. But most caterpillars then do not have enough proteins or amino acids and other things. So they typically mud puddle or go to rotting scats and animal droppings is to get these rare nutrients. And mud puddling, especially on wet soil, is then typically to pick up salts. Sodium especially has been identified as a very important component nutrient that butterflies and moths and other insects pick up when they're mud puddling. So nutrient gathering is one major reason why butterflies mud puddle. And males may not directly use them in making eggs, but they do pass them on to the females so that females can make eggs by using these nutrients. So sometimes females will mud puddle because they're not going to get enough nutrients from the males. And oftentimes you will see that older females mud puddle a lot more than young females. Young females almost never you will see them mud puddle. So I think older females, which are less likely to get any more matings and therefore more nutrients, probably go to mud puddle to get nutrients that males won't be passing on to them anymore, but they have to get them then themselves. So probably that's the reason why you typically see older females mud puddling. In most butterflies, there are some species in which young females start mud puddling, things like barons, for example. Some nymphalids, even females start mud puddling right from the young age. But in case of most butterflies, it's mostly the males which mud puddle, and occasionally, very occasionally, and very few females will do it. Not every old female will do it, but some old females you might see mud puddling for this reason. Okay, then let's take a question from the chat box. What is the most acceptable explanation regarding the development of Batesian mimicry in butterflies with regards to the concept of natural selection? Boy, I cannot address it in 2 minutes or 5 minutes. So how about either this month or some other time, we have a separate session on mimicry. At that time, let's take mimicry, because there's so much interesting about mimicry that we can discuss. That let's do that at another time. But if you want, our lab has published 2 or 3 really nice review papers on mimicry. The latest one actually is has just been published earlier this month in Annual Review of Ecology, Evolution and Systematics. So I will urge you to read that paper right now. But the simple thing is, mimicry has evolved, Batesian mimicry especially, which is what you have asked, to evade predation by mimicking just the external features of one of these toxic butterflies, one of these very well protected species. And because you resemble that toxic species, predators are not going to eat you. That's a basic idea of why Batesian mimicry has evolved in relation to natural selection. So that's a short answer. But long answer we'll really need to have separately. What I'll do is I'll in the chat box send you a link to my lab website, and you can go to the publications page and see what we have published, and you can see the papers there. Yeah, so I shared the link in the chat box. Just look up those papers and you will get a lot of information. All right, question from the web, Namrata.
Yeah, so Poonam Vanole has a question like, why are butterfly and moth wings so delicate, and how are they made?
Are wings so delicate and how are they made? Okay. So you want to actually take this? How are butterfly wings so thin and so delicate? All right.
So,
Riddhi?
yeah. So butterfly wings are mostly made of chitin, which is the same structure that you see on the external sort of exoskeleton that insects have. And so butterfly wings are made up of 2 layers of cells. That's what makes them very thin. And the scales that
2
you
layers
see,
of cells, you said.
yeah.
So basically wings are only 2 cells thin.
Yeah. So they're very, yeah.
So
2
2 cells
layers.
is really tiny.
Yeah.
You will realize.
And then they are, of course, they have additional material on top of that, which is deposited in the form of scales. So scales are the things that brush off on your fingers when you try to catch a butterfly. And so the scales are deposited on top of the cells, as we say. And that's what makes the butterfly wings very thin. And also, I guess, for flight, you do require aerodynamically optimized structures, which butterfly wings do provide.
All insects do.
All
actually.
insects
So most
do have
insects
that.
do have wings.
If you see beetles, for example, they'll have very thin membranous wings that carry quite large beetles. So even though they're quite thin, they are very
Reasonably strong that
strong
they can
that they can
help butterfly or other insects. All right. Then there's a question here. Is it okay to help caterpillars turn into butterflies at home? or should they be released on the trees outside where predation risk is higher? I often find caterpillars on the curry leaf we buy for cooking. I take care of their feeding by providing them fresh leaves every day. So Saili Ashar, from your question, it seems like you are a young student, and it's admirable that you try to feed them fresh leaves every day. If you're feeding these curry leaf, which is what we typically buy or grow in our gardens, probably your parents are not very happy that you are destroying your curry leaf plant. So it's nice that you're doing this. So we're not exactly helping caterpillars grow into butterflies when we keep them at home. We are helping us much more by enjoying seeing them grow rather than helping caterpillars grow much. One point that you made, that there is greater predation risk in nature. So in that sense, yes, you are helping them by protecting them. But we are not as good as caterpillars in taking care of themselves. So for example, if you keep them inside the house, you're either keeping them on a potted plant where they will feed, or you're keeping them in a small container where you will have to clean up the container every day and provide fresh food, fresh juicy food. And that second method is a little bit harder because you may not be very careful in cleaning up the containers as frequently as well. So you might actually be exposing them more to parasitism. Basically, you are keeping them in the same container where the poop is also lying all day long. So in that case, what you're doing is you're really exposing them to parasites rather than predators. So in that sense, you're not really exactly helping them. And parasites can be as dangerous, as damaging as predators. So I won't say you're helping them, but if it gives you pleasure, I think that's a good thing. But you should also learn to take care of them really well. Your mortality rate while raising caterpillars should really be close to zero. If it's close to zero, then perhaps you're helping them. But you also need to make sure that when the butterflies come out, they are the normal size that you see in nature. If they come out really small, then you haven't fed them enough before they pupated, in which case you're not really helping them, because smaller butterflies, like smaller everything else, typically don't live just as well, and they are not as successful in courtship and getting mates and then laying eggs. So if you do not feed them well, then you're hurting them actually a lot more. If you balance out all the risks and benefits of doing this at home, then you're probably hurting them a lot more than you're helping them. So avoid it if you can. But if you're doing a proper study of their life cycles or something else, then probably there's some justification for doing it. But again, do it well. Try to keep them on a plant which is large enough that they're not going to run out of food and that they will pupate comfortably, and also make sure that it's not a scheduled species, not a species legally protected in India. Otherwise, you will need to get permission from the forest department even to raise them like this. So you should also take care of these things. All right. Namrata, do you have any question?
Yeah, how do male butterflies produce pheromones?
How do they produce? That's a little bit harder question. Everything that butterflies produce is a result of some physiological activity. Now, which genes particularly make pheromones and what are the steps in making pheromones? I do not know. Do Riddhi and Vaishali know how are pheromones actually made, from the underlying genes to making the actual pheromones? What pathway?
Steroid pathway.
Steroid pathway. There goes
Yeah,
Riddhi.
so a lot of pheromones that butterflies produce are these steroid compounds. So it's a lipid metabolism pathway that helps them make it. If your question is with respect to where do butterflies make pheromones and how they disperse it,
That is easy to
that's another
address.
interesting question.
So a lot of butterflies basically have these pheromones in some glands, either inside the body or on the skin somewhere. Yeah? And in case of butterflies which make scent scales, so they're not exactly pheromones then, but these scent scales can be deposited in various parts of the butterfly wings. or on the body, but a lot of butterflies, like let's say tigers and crows, their pheromones can be, their scent scales can be stored on wings, and lysinids, blues and heristics, for example, again have some scent scales on the wings from which that scent is dispersed when they're coating. So depending on which group of butterflies we are talking about, it is known where they store all these pheromones, which glands do they store pheromones in, which parts of the body, wings or abdomen or wherever else they store these scent scales. But the physiological process of making pheromones, as Riddhi described, there are pathways known, chemical pathways known, which make these steroidal compounds. So, do you know of any particular pathway known in butterflies where that whole pathway is known? Perhaps in denines, in milkweed butterflies. In bicyclus, I don't think the pathway is known. Yeah. But not the pathway. Pathway has not been figured out. Maybe in milkweed butterflies it has been figured out, because milkweed butterflies have been studied by chemical ecologists a lot. So there perhaps the pathway is known, but I don't think the pathway is known in any other butterflies. But I'll look up and see if there are any very well-known pathways which make pheromones in butterflies.
So shall I ask the next question?
Sure.
Considering each migratory population is a new generation butterfly, how do they recognize their destinations?
That's a good question, but a fairly well-known answer. So most organisms which migrate, except in case of things like, let's say, elephants, where the matriarch is leading the group, and that is how they learn the migratory routes. In most other organisms which are known to migrate, they don't do it with experience. They don't learn from their previous generations where to migrate and so on. Only in certain kinds of mammals you will see that. A lot of antelopes and deer and cattle, and then things like elephants learn from that. Even migratory birds, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of migratory birds, known where actually the young birds start to migrate before even the adults. So even in their first flight, before winter, right after they are fledged, they already know where to fly. And that is so even in insects, which never have overlapping generations, which fly together, or very rarely do they have overlapping generations. So in insects, in butterflies, like in other insects, most of these things are instinctive. These have been encoded in the DNA of these butterflies, which get triggered based on the environmental cues that butterflies have, and that is how they will decide how to migrate. So that's about how they know where to migrate, which direction to go in. But I forgot that Vaishali is sitting here, and she's the migration expert, so I'll hand it over to her. And she will have many additional points to make.
Yeah, so migration, butterfly migration usually depends on various environmental cues. The ones that have been most studied in temperate climates, like Danaus flexibles, monarch butterflies, they rely on, these migrations depend on really reliable sort of environmental cues, like the winter temperatures and photoperiods and so on. So like Krishnamekh said, these things are instinctual, but they've done experiments, researchers have done experiments trying to manipulate the directions that these butterflies fly in. So they would rear the larvae and pupae in one location and then transport them to another location. And the butterflies start flying in a completely different direction compared to what they were supposed to fly in. So these kinds of experiments tell us that they probably rely on things like the position of the sun, and to fuel their flight, they probably rely on wind direction, which if the wind direction isn't in the correct direction, that can mess up their migratory flight. So these things are hard-coded, but in practice, they can misfire. Basically.
if you raise caterpillars in one place and release butterflies in another place, they will fly as if they're flying in the original location where we were growing as caterpillars, right? Which means that they will decide in the caterpillar stages itself where they fly based on what they experience. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that where they should fly, perhaps depending on environmental cues, is also encoded in the genome, where you can move them somewhere else, but that doesn't take care of the genomic imprinting or genomic encoding of where to fly, right? It only encodes. So
it lets them,
wait. So the question is, if there is some population structure, if butterflies from a certain region will always fly in a certain direction and will always fly at a certain distance, then it could also be purely genetic. So you will need to separate out genetic component from the developmental component.
Yes.
The environmental component.
Yeah.
So what do we know about these two components? How much of it is genetic? How much of it is environmental cues?
So genetic cues. Someone asked about the circadian rhythm earlier. So we all know that the Drosophila is usually used as a model system for insects, right? There's one particular gene that's present in all insects except Drosophila. That's the Cry2 gene. It's is it a cryptochrome or a cytochrome? Cryptochrome, yeah. The cryptochrome 2 gene. So we think that the cryptochrome 2 gene is connects the circadian rhythm of the butterfly to its sensory perception, and that's one cue for migration. For development, developmental pathways, I'm not really sure, because the environmental cues that these butterflies depend on, they can sometimes be contradictory and they haven't really been elucidated. So it's really difficult to get pupae that would not normally go into diapause. It's really difficult to get them into diapause, and vice versa. So there is a disconnect between the genetic and developmental phases.
So if you really want to mess up a butterfly, what you should do is a migratory butterfly. Take caterpillars, separate them out from the same family into two batches, grow one in a completely different area, grow one in the same area where they're from. And when they have gone through this experience, switch their places and then see where they fly. So if it's purely genetic, they should fly in the same direction and in the same for the same distance, but they will just be flying parallelly because you have separated them in space. Yeah? So if it's purely genetic, that is what you should see. If it is not purely genetic, there's some environmental component or purely environmental component, then if you grow them in two different places and then switch their places, they should fly based on where they grew up rather than where you release them. Yeah. This is the mind of a devious scientist. You have to think of some really you have to think of ways to really mess up what they genetically are encoded for, or mess up their learning, and then see what happens. When you tweak these things like this, it becomes a little bit more interesting.
So there's another question about migration. I think Vaishali should answer that.
Sure.
So climate change causes changes in rainfall pattern, thereby migratory period of butterflies. Does that affect fecundity of the female migrants?
Honestly, we don't know, because we do know that irregular monsoons have affected migrations in the past, because these migrations do depend on the monsoons especially in tropical habitats like peninsular India. So they do mess up the life cycles, but in broad patterns where entire populations might crash. For individual females, I don't know if they would actually respond to rainfall patterns in terms of fecundity. they might not even enter the reproductive phase if their migration is messed up. So that's what would lead to a population crash, not necessarily individual fecundity.
All right, so it's past 8. So let's take final question. So
Yeah,
Deepika,
I
can
do
you
have
listen
just
carefully?
one question. Last one. Okay,
Alright.
so is identification of similar looking butterflies important from a conservational viewpoint?
Depends on what you're doing. If you're similar looking butterfly, one is a critically endangered species and the other one is not, then you obviously have to identify them. But if you're saying that there are 500 species and you want to create a butterfly habitat so that all these species can be conserved, then you don't need identity of every individual species. But again, not every species is going to be equally common or equally endangered. So you do need identity. I'll give you an example. There's a butterfly called crimson bordered windmill, yeah, which is a Schedule 1 species legally protected in India. And then you have several other species of windmills which look somewhat similar. If you don't know what crimson bordered windmill looks like, then how are you going to conserve it? So it really, really depends on your question and your species under investigation. But ideally, you should know what you're trying to conserve. Just saying, oh, I'm going to create a habitat for butterflies isn't really going to help, because you might create a habitat where butterflies are really abundant. You might find them in hundreds and thousands. But if you have created, for example, if you have destroyed an evergreen forest and created a garden, sure, you might get a million immigrants, but that doesn't help you conserve butterflies. So species identity and what is the kind of a habitat you're going to conserve or create for conservation really is going to depend on what species are in the environment. And you need to be able to understand which species are doing better in your conservation area and which species are not doing well in your conservation area. So from that perspective as well, species identity is important. Otherwise, you might end up with a situation where the same 50 species, which are very, very widespread, let's say all over Asia, are going to be seen in every single city, in every single conservation area. And the remaining 300, 1300 species that you need to conserve in India, which are native species, which are forest dependent species or altitudinal belt dependent species, species which are really going to need some conservation action, you might end up destroying them. So these are all the different reasons why you should care about which species you are trying to conserve and how you're going to monitor whether your conservation efforts are actually yielding the results that you would wish to see. For both these reasons, I think it's important. All right, it's 8:07, which is when we started this chat. So I hope that we were able to address some really interesting questions, but I'm pretty sure you'll have lots more. So maybe let's try to have another informal chat in a few months. Yeah. Again,
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for organizing this, and I will certainly be very interested in doing this in a few more months. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Krishnamegh. Bye,
Bye.
Riddhi. Bye, Vaishali.
Thank you, Riddhi and Vaishali.